The world watched in disbelief as the United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session and delivered a message that echoed through diplomatic corridors from New York to Caracas to Moscow. America, the nation that helped build the post-war international order, now stands accused by its own allies of trampling on the very principles it once championed. Inside that chamber, something shifted that cannot be easily reversed, and the consequences will reverberate across every continent for years to come. If you want to understand what just happened, why it matters, and what it means for the future of global cooperation, you need to keep watching, because this is a story that touches every single person on this planet. When the Brazilian ambassador to the United Nations stood before the Security Council on Monday and declared that American military action constituted a, quote, very serious affront to sovereignty that sets an extremely dangerous precedent for the entire international community, he was not alone. 9 nations aligned behind that same fundamental objection, ranging from traditional American partners like Colombia and Spain to geopolitical rivals like Russia and China. This was not a partisan gathering or a collection of countries hostile to the United States. This was a broad coalition of the international community saying in one voice that something had gone very wrong. Secretary General Antonio Guterres delivered his assessment through UN Political Affairs Chief Rosemary DiCarlo, expressing deep concern about the intensification of instability in Venezuela, the potential impact on the entire region, and the precedent this action might set for how nations interact with each other going forward. The Secretary General urged all Venezuelan actors to engage in inclusive and democratic dialogue, offering United Nations support for a peaceful resolution to a crisis that appeared to be spiraling beyond anyone's control. The core of the controversy centers on what the United States government characterized as a law enforcement operation, and what Venezuela and its supporters labeled a crime of aggression. The distinction matters enormously because it determines whether the action falls within the boundaries of international law or crosses them entirely. American officials, including UN Ambassador Mike Waltz, insisted that the strikes were justified under Article 51 of the UN Charter, which enshrines the right to self-defense, and that the operation targeted long-standing criminal indictments against an illegitimate leader. Waltz described the operation as a law enforcement action carried out in pursuit of justice, not an act of war against Venezuela or its people, and he invoked the 1989 capture of Panama's former leader Manuel Noriega as historical precedent for such actions. Venezuela's UN ambassador Samuel Moncada painted an entirely different picture, describing the operation as an illegitimate armed attack lacking any legal justification that included the kidnapping of the constitutional president and his wife. Moncada demanded that the Security Council condemn the ongoing aggression, ensure that the United States withdraws its military, and protect Venezuela's sovereignty and territorial integrity. He quoted Simón Bolívar, the 19th century independence leader, saying the United States seems destined by providence to plague Latin America with misery in the name of liberty. And he added a direct challenge. It is not drugs, it is not security, it is not freedom, it is oil, it is the mines, it is the land. Russia and China, both permanent members of the Security Council with veto power, piled on with particularly harsh rhetoric. Moscow's ambassador described the intervention as a turn back to the era of lawlessness, arguing that the United States cannot proclaim itself as some kind of supreme judge with the right to invade any country, label culprits, hand down punishments, and enforce them regardless of international law sovereignty or non-intervention principles. China's representative echoed those concerns, saying the United States had wantonly trampled upon Venezuela's sovereignty and violated the principle of sovereign equality among nations. Beijing demanded that Washington change course, cease its bullying and coercive practices, and return to the path of political solutions through dialogue and negotiation. The Cuban ambassador went furthest, telling the Security Council that the American military attack had no justification whatsoever, characterizing it as imperialist and fascist aggression with objectives of domination. While the Council remained paralyzed by the familiar divisions among its most powerful members, with any censure certain to be blocked by an American veto, the symbolic and political damage had already been done. The question of legitimacy had been posed and answered by the international community in a way that the United States could not simply dismiss or vote away. Let me pause here for a moment because this next section is crucial for understanding the full scope of what is happening. Make sure you are subscribed and have notifications enabled because we are going to be tracking this story as it develops, and you do not want to miss any of the breaking developments. The situation in Venezuela did not emerge in a vacuum. For months, the Trump administration had been escalating military presence and operations off Venezuela's coast, describing these actions as part of what it calls a non-international armed conflict against drug cartels and trafficking organizations. UN Assistant Secretary General Khaled Kiari told the Security Council in December that American military presence had expanded significantly since the Council last discussed the issue in October, further heightening tensions in an already volatile region. The strikes on alleged drug vessels in the southern Caribbean Sea and the eastern Pacific continued throughout this period, with American authorities reporting that 105 individuals had been killed in these strikes since early September. The exact locations remained undisclosed, with American officials stating that they occurred in international waters or within the U.S. Southern Command's area of responsibility. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights weighed in with a formal warning that these airstrikes violated international human rights law, emphasizing that countering drug trafficking is a law enforcement matter governed by strict limits on the use of lethal force, not a military problem that can be solved through aerial bombardment. Beyond the direct military action, the administration designated the Cartel de los Soles a foreign terrorist organization, declared Venezuelan airspace closed in its entirety, seized oil tankers, imposed new sanctions, and announced what President Trump described as a total and complete blockade of sanctioned oil shipments. Venezuela responded by denouncing these actions as a unilateral naval blockade and a violation of international law, with its navy reportedly beginning to escort petroleum tankers in what appeared to be a direct challenge to American enforcement. The aviation impact proved immediate and tangible, as most international airlines suspended flights to Venezuela following the airspace closure announcement, further isolating the country and its people from the global transportation network. This escalation came despite opposition from within the United States itself. Republicans in the U.S. Senate voted down legislation that would have put a check on the administration's ability to use deadly military force against drug traffickers, reflecting the deep partisan divide over how to address the situation and whether congressional authorization should be required for such operations. Now, here is where the story takes an even more dramatic turn. 1 week after the Security Council emergency meeting, the Trump administration announced it would withdraw the United States from 66 international organizations, agencies, and commissions, including 31 United Nations entities. The executive order signed by President Trump stated that these organizations undermine America's independence and waste taxpayer dollars on ineffective or hostile agendas. Among the agencies named were UN Women, the UN Population Fund, and critically, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has served as the legal basis for global efforts to limit heat-trapping emissions for the past 3 decades. The withdrawal list did not include some of the UN's major agencies like UNICEF or the World Food Program, but the scope of the decision still represented a dramatic restructuring of American engagement with the international system. Secretary of State Marco Rubio framed the decisions as not only saving American taxpayer dollars, but also ending what he characterized as a meaningless expenditure of energy in international forums that were, in his words, mismanaged, unnecessary, wasteful, and poorly run. The UN Secretary General responded by saying he regrets the announcement and has consistently underscored that assessed contributions to the United Nations regular budget and peacekeeping budget are a legal obligation under the UN Charter for all member states, including the United States. Experts across the political spectrum offered starkly different interpretations of what this withdrawal means. Nina Schwalbe, a senior scholar at Georgetown Center for Global Health Policy and Politics, called the action ridiculous, dangerous, thoughtless, and malicious, noting that the administration had already withdrawn from the World Health Organization, which she compared to cutting down a tree. Now, she said, they are cutting down the whole forest, with implications that will extend far and wide from children's education to climate change to art and culture. Brett Schaefer, a UN expert at the American Enterprise Institute, had the opposite take, saying he would have liked to see the United States withdraw from more organizations and more significant ones. He described the executive order as pruning around the margins and expressed disappointment that the largest recipients of American funding in the UN system were largely unaddressed by the order. The climate implications of this withdrawal are particularly significant. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was ratified by the U.S. Senate in 1992 under President George H.W. Bush, and its withdrawal means that after this one-year notice period, the United States will be the only country not engaged in the UNFCCC, standing alone among all nations on the planet in its formal disengagement from the international climate framework. Environmental organizations responded with alarm, with the Natural Resources Defense Council noting that the United States could rejoin the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement under a future administration, but the damage to American credibility and leadership in the interim could prove difficult to repair. What does all of this mean for real people on the ground? Beth Schlachter, who works for the global charity MSI Reproductive Choices, described the human impact in stark terms. She said the U.S. had previously halted funding for the UN Population Fund before this week's formal withdrawal, causing profound impacts. Clinics have shut down, doctors have been pushed out of work, nurses and community health workers are no longer available, and medical supplies are no longer on shelves. Pregnant women are now transmitting HIV to their unborn children or fetuses. Schlachter called the situation catastrophic, and she warned that completely withdrawing from the agency will further undermine its legitimacy in a gratuitous way that continues to take a bite at the integrity of the UN itself. Thomas Bollocky, director of the Global Health Program at the Council on Foreign Relations, offered a broader geopolitical analysis. He noted that the Trump administration wants to address issues that are on the agendas of these groups, including counterterrorism, energy, child trafficking, and health. But it wants to do so outside the international system, emphasizing bilateral agreements worked out directly between the United States and one other country as its new strategy. Bollocky cautioned that there are limitations to this approach, pointing out that after months of negotiations, the administration had so far reached deals with only 9 African countries in the healthcare space alone, whereas multilateral groups already have buy-in from many countries, even ones that the United States is not friendly with. The withdrawal, he said, will have everyday effects on Americans because it is difficult to make progress on health, climate, environmental, or counterterrorism challenges that by their very nature span borders and require international cooperation to address effectively. If you are just joining us, make sure to go back and watch from the beginning because we are connecting several important dots that you need to see to fully understand this situation. The symbolism of these withdrawals sends a clear message to other countries about American priorities and willingness to engage constructively with the international community. Daniel Forty, who leads UN affairs at the International Crisis Group, said the move is the latest in a number of steps the Trump administration has taken to distance the U.S. from multilateral organizations, where many countries collaborate to address global problems. There is a perception, he explained, that many of these international organizations were dominated by a progressive ideology, particularly focused on gender equality, environmental matters, and climate change. And this is an effort to remove the United States from those venues. But there is very little the United States gets in exchange for having done so, certainly not much financial savings, and not much savings in terms of resources or influence. Schwalbe offered a particularly ominous prediction about the geopolitical consequences of American withdrawal. She said stepping back from many international organizations leaves a door wide open for Chinese dominance of the UN system and processes. China has been steadily increasing its influence within the United Nations system for years, and American withdrawal creates a power vacuum that Beijing appears prepared to fill with its own vision of how the international system should operate. The implications extend beyond any single organization or issue. The withdrawal from multiple UN agencies affects America's ability to shape global norms, standards, and practices across a wide range of domains. Without American participation, the United States loses its voice in debates over how these organizations should be run, what priorities they should pursue, and how they should address emerging global challenges. This loss of voice translates directly into loss of influence, which cannot be easily recovered even if a future administration decides to re-engage. Now let us step back and examine the deeper pattern that connects these seemingly disparate events. The Emergency Security Council meeting over Venezuela and the subsequent announcement of mass withdrawals from international organizations are not unrelated developments. They represent two aspects of the same fundamental shift in American foreign policy orientation. One side involves aggressive unilateral action against nations the administration deems problematic, using military force and economic coercion without seeking international authorization or legitimacy. The other side involves walking away from the very institutions that provide the framework for international cooperation and that constrain how powerful nations can act without consequence. Together, these moves send a powerful signal about how the Trump administration understands American power and its role in the world. The administration appears to believe that the United States can achieve its objectives through sheer force of will, and that international institutions are obstacles to American interests rather than instruments that serve them. This worldview has deep roots in American political culture, but its practical implications are profound and far-reaching. International institutions exist because nations recognize that some problems cannot be solved unilaterally, and that the costs of unchecked power exercised without constraint ultimately exceed the benefits of short-term gains. The United Nations, for all its imperfections and bureaucratic inefficiencies, provides a forum where nations can resolve disputes through diplomacy rather than war, where norms against aggression can be articulated and at least sometimes enforced, and where smaller nations can have a voice alongside larger and more powerful ones. When the United States chooses to ignore these norms and institutions, it weakens the entire system that has helped prevent great power conflicts and maintain a modicum of international stability for nearly 80 years. The emergency session of the Security Council revealed how deeply this decision resonates across the international community. 9 nations, including American allies like Brazil, Colombia, and Spain, joined in condemning the Venezuelan operation as a violation of international law and a threat to the principles that underpin the global order. Even nations that have their own documented problems with respecting international norms, such as Russia following its invasion of Ukraine, felt empowered to lecture the United States about the importance of sovereignty and non-intervention. This ironic inversion of the usual rhetorical positions reflects something deeper than ordinary geopolitical competition. It reflects a widespread recognition that if the rules do not constrain the most powerful nation, then those rules have no meaning at all, and the entire structure of international law collapses into a simple statement that might makes right. For the Venezuelan people, the immediate consequences of this crisis are already severe. The airspace closure has cut them off from international air travel. Economic sanctions have further squeezed an already struggling economy. Military strikes have killed more than 100 people in a region where collateral damage and civilian casualties are almost impossible to avoid. The strikes, which American officials justified as targeting drug traffickers, occurred in international waters or unspecified locations, raising questions about whether proper precautions were taken to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, whether the rules of engagement were appropriate for law enforcement operations versus military action, and whether the death toll figures provided by American authorities are accurate or complete. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has raised formal concerns about whether these strikes violate international human rights law, and those concerns deserve serious attention regardless of one's views about the Venezuelan government or the drug cartels that operate in the region. All people, including people accused of criminal activity, possess fundamental rights that cannot be disregarded simply because they are inconvenient or because labeling them terrorists makes it easier to ignore those rights. Now let us think about what comes next. The Security Council cannot take effective action because the United States holds veto power and will block any resolution that criticizes its conduct. But the Council can serve as a forum for articulating international opinion and for demonstrating that the United States stands increasingly isolated among its supposed allies and partners. This isolation has concrete consequences for American foreign policy. It makes it harder to build coalitions for addressing other global challenges, from climate change to nuclear proliferation to pandemic response. It creates openings for China and Russia to position themselves as defenders of the international order, even as they violate its principles in their own ways. And it weakens the normative framework that makes international cooperation possible by demonstrating that the most powerful nation in the system chooses not to be bound by the rules it expects others to follow. If you have found this analysis useful, please share it with others who might benefit from understanding what is happening and why it matters. The more people who engage with these issues seriously, the better our collective chances of navigating the challenges ahead. The withdrawal from 66 international organizations will take time to fully implement, and the one-year notice period for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change means there is still a window during which the decision could theoretically be reversed. But reversals require political will, and that will is currently lacking within the administration. The decision reflects a genuine ideological commitment to unilateralism and skepticism about multilateral cooperation, not merely a tactical maneuver that can be easily undone if circumstances change. Experts and advocates across the ideological spectrum seem to agree on one thing: these decisions will have consequences that extend far beyond what anyone can fully predict or control. The international system is not a machine that continues operating regardless of who participates and how they engage. It is a set of relationships, norms, and institutions that depend on the active participation and good faith engagement of its most powerful members. When those members withdraw, the system weakens, and it becomes harder to address the global challenges that affect everyone, including Americans. Climate change does not pause because the United States withdraws from the Paris Agreement or the UN Framework Convention. Drug trafficking does not stop because the United States bombs boats in the Caribbean. Pandemics do not respect national boundaries or wait for bilateral negotiations to conclude before spreading across borders. These problems require collective action, and collective action requires institutions that can facilitate coordination among nations with different interests and perspectives. We are witnessing a fundamental experiment in whether American power alone, exercised without reference to international norms or institutions, can solve problems that have never responded to such approaches in the past. The emergency session of the Security Council was, in a sense, a preview of how the international community will respond to the results of that experiment. The condemnation was nearly unanimous. The concerns were deep and widespread. The questions about legality and legitimacy were posed with precision and clarity. What remains to be seen is whether those concerns will translate into effective countermeasures or whether they will remain expressions of disapproval that have no practical impact on American policy. One thing is certain: the world is watching, and the decisions being made right now will shape the international landscape for decades to come. Thank you for watching this analysis. Please like this video if you found it informative and engaging. Your support helps these videos reach more people who deserve to understand what is happening in our world. If you have thoughts about these developments, please share them in the comments below. What do you think about the emergency UN session and the condemnation of American policy? What do you think about the withdrawal from international organizations? How do you think these decisions will affect America's standing in the world and its ability to address global challenges? I read every comment and appreciate the engagement and perspectives that you bring to these discussions. Together we can work toward a better understanding of the forces shaping our world and the choices we face as citizens and members of an interconnected global community. Subscribe now if you have not already, and hit the notification bell so you will be alerted when we publish new analyses of breaking developments and long-term trends. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and remember that understanding the world around us is the first step toward making it better.